She thought no one saw her pain as she wiped away her tears, but one man did. His quiet act of kindness didn't just comfort her, it turned her world around in ways no one could have predicted. What did he do, and how did it change everything? The morning rush had just ended at Eddie's diner, a cozy spot tucked along a quiet stretch of town. The place was known for its warm, welcoming atmosphere, but today a subtle tension hung in the air. Behind the counter, Sarah, a young waitress in her late 20s, moved mechanically as she refilled coffee cups and cleared plates. Her eyes were puffy, and every now and then she'd turn away, wiping at her face with the sleeve of her uniform. She tried to hide it, but the pain was etched into her features, a sadness that even her forced smile couldn't conceal. Seated at a corner booth was James, a middle-aged black man dressed in a crisp shirt and tie. He was quietly reading a newspaper while sipping his coffee, but his sharp eyes missed nothing. He noticed the way Sarah avoided eye contact with customers, the tremble in her hands as she carried a tray, and the faint sniffles she tried to suppress. As she passed by his table to collect an empty plate, James glanced up and spoke softly. "Rough day." Startled, Sarah froze for a moment before managing a weak smile. "Oh, you know how it is. Just another busy shift," she replied, her voice betraying her attempt at nonchalance. James didn't press further, but his gaze lingered on her for a moment before she hurried off. He had seen that look before, the weariness of someone carrying a burden too heavy to bear alone. The diner buzzed with its usual mix of chatter and clinking dishes, but James couldn't shake the image of Sarah's tear-streaked face. He observed her as she interacted with the customers, her polite demeanor masking an undercurrent of sorrow. A group of teenagers laughed loudly in the far corner, oblivious to the fact that Sarah flinched slightly every time they shouted for her attention. An elderly couple at the counter smiled kindly at her, but even their warmth didn't seem to reach her. James folded his newspaper and leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. He had come to Eddie's for a quiet breakfast before a business meeting, but now his focus was entirely on Sarah. He could see she was struggling, and something inside him stirred, a deep-seated conviction that he couldn't ignore. He reached for his coffee, his fingers tapping against the cup as he pondered what to do. He didn't know her story, but he knew one thing for certain. Everyone deserves a little kindness, especially when the world seems to be weighing them down. The bell above the door jingled as a few customers left, and Sarah finally had a moment to catch her breath. She leaned against the counter, her eyes briefly closing as she took a deep inhale. "Hey, Sarah," one of the cooks called from the kitchen. "You okay out there?" Sarah forced another smile and gave a thumbs up. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just a lot on my mind." James watched the brief exchange, noting the way her shoulders slumped as soon as she thought no one was looking. He decided then and there, he couldn't just sit by and do nothing. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a small notepad and pen, the kind he always carried for jotting down ideas or reminders. He hesitated for a moment, his pen hovering over the paper. Then, with deliberate care, he began to write. James's pen glided across the notepad as he carefully crafted his message. His words were thoughtful, infused with compassion and understanding. He didn't know the specifics of Sarah's struggles, but he knew enough to offer encouragement that could resonate with anyone in pain. Meanwhile, Sarah continued moving through the diner, her steps slower now as the lunch crowd began to trickle in. Her co-workers occasionally gave her sympathetic glances, but no one dared to pry. Sarah had always been the type to keep her problems to herself. Back at his booth, James paused to reread the note. His handwriting was neat, the kind that revealed his attention to detail. He had written, "I don't know what you're going through, but I can see you're carrying a heavy burden. Remember, you are stronger than you think, and brighter days are ahead. Please don't give up. Kindness and resilience will always find their way back to you. A friend." Satisfied, James folded the note carefully and slipped it into an envelope he had in his briefcase. He placed the envelope under his coffee cup and waved over another server to settle his bill. "Leaving so soon?" the waitress asked, as she handed him his receipt. "Busy day ahead," James replied with a polite smile. His eyes flicked toward Sarah, who was bent over a table, wiping it down. "Make sure she gets that," he added, gesturing subtly toward the envelope under his cup. The waitress looked confused but nodded, picking up the coffee cup and envelope as James walked toward the door. Sarah didn't notice the exchange. She was too preoccupied with the overwhelming thoughts swirling in her mind. Bills piling up at home, a broken-down car she couldn't afford to fix, and the lingering pain of losing someone close to her. All of it weighed heavily on her. As she moved toward the counter to grab a new stack of menus, the other waitress intercepted her, holding out the envelope. "Hey, Sarah, this was left for you at table 6, she said, her tone tinged with curiosity. "For me?" Sarah asked, frowning slightly. She wiped her hands on her apron before taking the envelope. "Yeah, the guy who was sitting there told me to make sure you got it," the waitress replied before walking off to tend to another table. Sarah stared at the envelope for a moment, her heart racing. It wasn't every day that customers left her anything besides the occasional thank you note or small tip. She slid a finger under the flap and pulled out the neatly folded piece of paper inside. Her eyes scanned the words, and as she read, her hands began to tremble. The message was simple, yet profound, speaking directly to the pain she had been trying so hard to hide. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she clutched the note against her chest. She glanced around the diner, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man who had left it, but he was already gone. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt something shift inside her, a glimmer of hope, a reminder that she wasn't invisible, and that someone out there cared enough to notice her struggles. She wiped her tears quickly, not wanting to draw attention, but her smile was different this time. It was genuine, albeit small, as if the note had planted a seed of strength she thought she'd lost. Sarah slipped the note into her pocket, feeling its weight not as paper but as something far more meaningful, a lifeline. She went back to her duties, but her steps were lighter, her movements more purposeful. She wasn't sure why the note had struck such a chord with her, but it had. As the lunch crowd began to fill the diner, Sarah found herself stealing moments to think about the man who had left it. She remembered his calm demeanor, the way he had noticed her pain when everyone else was too busy to care. Later in the day, during a brief lull, Sarah stood by the counter and reread the note. The words seemed to speak directly to the doubts and fears that had been consuming her. For weeks, she had felt like she was sinking, drowning under the weight of financial troubles and personal heartbreak. She had recently lost her younger brother, Michael, to an unexpected illness. They had been close, and his passing left a gaping hole in her life. On top of that, her landlord had raised her rent, and she was barely scraping by. The broken car sitting idle in her driveway was just another reminder of how everything seemed to be falling apart. But this note, it was as if the man who wrote it had seen straight into her soul. Sarah's co-worker Jenna walked over and leaned on the counter beside her. "You okay? You've been staring at that thing all day," she said, nodding toward the note. Sarah hesitated before handing it over. "Here, read it." Jenna unfolded the paper and scanned it quickly. Her eyes softened and she smiled. "Wow, that's really sweet. Who left this?" "The guy who was sitting at table 6 this morning," Sarah replied. "I didn't even get his name." Jenna handed the note back, her expression thoughtful. "Well, whoever he is, he's got a good heart. You don't see much of that anymore." Sarah nodded, clutching the note tightly. "Yeah, he does." Meanwhile, James was driving across town, his mind still on the young waitress. He had been in her shoes once, not as a waitress, but as someone who felt like the world was closing in, with no way out. Years ago, when James was just starting out in his career, he had hit rock bottom. Struggling to pay rent and keep food on the table, he had been ready to give up. It was a stranger's kind words that had turned his life around, giving him the courage to keep going. He hadn't forgotten that moment, and now, whenever he saw someone in need, he felt compelled to pay it forward. James parked his car outside the office building where his meeting was scheduled, but before stepping out, he pulled out his phone and typed a quick message to his wife. James, saw someone today who reminded me how much small gestures can matter. Hope to share the story tonight. Back at the diner, Sarah folded the note carefully and tucked it into her apron pocket. As the day wore on, she found herself looking at her customers differently. For the first time in a while, she felt a spark of connection, a reminder that kindness existed even in the most unexpected places. When her shift ended, Sarah sat in her car for a moment, staring at the note again. It wasn't just the words that moved her, it was the fact that someone had cared enough to write them. She thought about her brother, Michael, and how he had always encouraged her to keep going, no matter how hard life got. "You're stronger than you think," he used to say, and those words echoed now in the stranger's message. Sarah made a decision right then. She wasn't going to let her struggles define her. She was going to fight back, one step at a time. The next morning, Sarah woke up feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The note from the mysterious man had stayed on her nightstand, and she read it again before heading into work. It wasn't just a piece of paper anymore. It was a reminder that someone believed in her, even if they didn't know her whole story. At the diner, she dove into her shift with renewed energy. Her co-workers noticed the change almost immediately. "Morning, sunshine," Jenna teased as Sarah walked in with a genuine smile. "What's got you in such a good mood?" Sarah shrugged, tying her apron. "Just decided to start looking at things differently, I guess." Jenna smirked knowingly, but didn't press further. The day passed quickly, and as Sarah served customers, she started to think about how she could turn her life around. The kindness of a stranger had lit a spark, but she knew it was up to her to keep that flame alive. She started by making a few calls during her break. First, she contacted a local mechanic to see if she could work out a payment plan for her car repairs. Next, she called her landlord to discuss her rent situation. It wasn't easy, but for the first time, she felt like she had the strength to face her problems head-on. As the afternoon crowd thinned out, a familiar face walked into the diner. It was James. He had returned, though this time he carried no briefcase and wasn't dressed for business. He scanned the room, spotting Sarah behind the counter. She froze for a moment, surprised to see him again, but quickly regained her composure. Picking up a coffee pot, she approached his table. "Back again so soon?" she asked with a smile, pouring him a fresh cup. James chuckled softly. "Well, the coffee's good, and the service isn't bad either." Sarah blushed slightly, setting the pot down. "Thank you, and thanks for what you left yesterday." The note. James raised an eyebrow, feigning ignorance. "Note? What note?" Sarah laughed lightly, shaking her head. "Don't play coy. It was you, wasn't it?" James leaned back in his seat, his expression turning serious. "Maybe it was. But the words weren't mine. They were yours. I just put them on paper." Sarah frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you've always had the strength to get through this," James said. "Sometimes, we just need a little reminder of what we're capable of." His words hit her harder than she expected, and for a moment, she didn't know what to say. "Thank you," she finally whispered. "You have no idea how much that meant to me." James smiled warmly. "You're stronger than you think, Sarah. Don't ever forget that." The rest of the day passed in a blur, but Sarah couldn't stop thinking about their conversation. As she finished her shift and headed home, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She spent the evening going over her finances, mapping out a plan to catch up on her bills. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Before going to bed, she wrote something down on a small piece of paper and tucked it into her wallet. It read, "Kindness and resilience will always find their way back to you." The days that followed felt different for Sarah. It wasn't that her problems had disappeared. They were still there, looming. But the note and James's words had given her a new perspective. She had started tackling her challenges one at a time, armed with a determination she hadn't felt in years. At the diner, her co-workers noticed the change. Jenna couldn't help but comment. "I don't know what's gotten into you, but it's good to see you smiling again," she said as they cleaned up after the lunch rush. Sarah grinned. "Just decided to stop letting life get the best of me." Jenna nodded, but there was a hint of pride in her expression. One evening, as Sarah finished her shift, she found herself thinking about James again. She couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to thank him properly, not just for the note, but for seeing her when no one else did. She asked around the diner to see if anyone knew him, but James had kept a low profile. Frustrated but not deterred, Sarah decided to leave it to chance. A week later, as she was closing up the diner, the bell above the door jingled. She looked up, and there he was. James stepped inside, his warm smile making the dimly lit diner feel a little brighter. "Late night coffee," she teased, grabbing a cup. "Something like that," James replied, taking a seat at the counter. Sarah poured him a fresh cup and set it in front of him. This time she didn't hold back. "I've been looking for you," she said, leaning on the counter. James raised an eyebrow, amused. "Oh? What for?" "To thank you," Sarah said earnestly. "Not just for the note, but for noticing me. For reminding me that I'm not invisible. You didn't have to do that, but you did, and it changed everything." James nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "You didn't need my help, Sarah. You had it in you all along. I just gave you a nudge." Sarah smiled, her eyes glistening. "Well, that nudge meant more than you'll ever know." They sat in companionable silence for a moment before James spoke again. "You know, kindness is like a ripple," he said. "You never know how far it'll go or who it'll reach, but it always starts with one small act." Sarah nodded, holding on to his words. "I'll make sure to pass it on," she promised. Weeks turned into months, and Sarah's life continued to improve. She had managed to get her car fixed, caught up on her bills, and even started saving for her future. The note from James remained tucked in her wallet, a constant reminder of the moment that changed her perspective. At the diner, she started to notice things she hadn't before: customers who seemed down, co-workers who needed a kind word. She began leaving little notes of her own, inspired by James's gesture. One day, a young man sat at the counter, his head bowed as he stared at his coffee. Sarah slid a folded note onto the counter beside him. The man looked up, surprised. "What's this?" Sarah smiled. "Just something I thought you might need." The man opened the note, reading the familiar words. "You are stronger than you think, and brighter days are ahead." As Sarah walked away, the man stared at the note, his expression softening. The ripple had started again, and Sarah knew it would carry on, just as James had said. She glanced out the diner window, her heart full of gratitude. Sometimes, all it took was one small act to change everything. Description: a struggling waitress thought no one noticed her tears as she worked through another overwhelming day at the diner. But one kind-hearted customer did. With a simple yet powerful note, he not only lifted her spirits, but set off a chain of events that would change her life forever. What did the note say, and how did it inspire a transformation she never expected? This heartwarming story of compassion and resilience proves that even the smallest acts of kindness can ripple into something extraordinary. Subscribe for more inspiring stories that will touch your heart and remind you of the power of kindness. Don't forget to like, comment, and share this story with someone who needs a little hope today.